Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drilldown, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. The co-pilot for this program, Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you?
Mr. Schweizer, great to see you as always. And I have to say, I'm impressed with your level of humility today because given the events of the last week, you could be, forgiven for walking with a slightly grander air than normal.
Well, I can certainly try. I'll certainly work on my gait. But yeah, we also want to praise government when they start to move in a good, constructive direction. What we're talking about, of course, is this new report that came out from Congress, the China Select Committee report on fentanyl. And what did they find on fentanyl?
A page turner, as it were. We reference it as if this was reported widely in every newspaper across America. Sadly, it was not. And there's a couple different reasons for that. But why we think it's a big deal is, number one, is it, I think, has carried the investigation that you began in Blood Money even further. And we'll talk about the new things we know about China and their role they're playing in actively killing Americans via fentanyl poisoning. But number two, it's always a big deal for us when we do reporting and it gets published and we go out and we do a big media rollout as we've done for your book. And oh, by the way, it hit number one on the New York Times bestseller list for a few different times. But then when members of Congress, I think, validate and help build on the reporting, we don't take that for granted. It's a big deal. And I think even bigger of a deal is while your reporting in your book was covered mostly in conservative media outlets, the China fentanyl problem is actually, because of this congressional report, being talked about by members on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's one of those few examples of bipartisanship. We're great to see that. And look, the government is moving in the right direction. And I think it is a validation of the research and the work that we do here. We're not pulling this stuff out of nowhere when we report.
Or worse.
From other dark nether regions.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's a confirmation and validation that we do actual real research. We use government, corporate records, financial records. And that's what I think is important. So what this report says is somewhat limited in scope. I think what we cover in the book is even more broad-based and even more damning. But again, we need to give the government credit. What were some of the key findings of this House Select Committee report on China with regards to fentanyl?
Yeah, I think that the main takeaway, as said by Representative Jake Auchincloss, a Democrat from Illinois, says what we see here is the state-sponsored poisoning of the United States on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, that's the headline. That's the takeaway. And you've got members of Congress on both sides of the aisle saying it. They're doing it in a couple of different ways. Now, it's interesting because what you've talked about in Blood Money as it relates to, let's say, TikTok, and I want to give people a way to think about it that's maybe accessible, because you can talk about fentanyl and chemicals and precursor, and it gets a little like test preppy, right?
Yeah.
It's technical.
You don't want to speak the words of all the precursors, give the names?
I feel like I would utter a Chinese expletive if I did that on accident. But so we know TikTok's bad.
Yeah.
We know TikTok's bad for everybody. Everybody said, oh my gosh, like their algorithms, highly addictive. They've proven a way that's not legal in China for them to use the TikTok that we have in the United States.
Right.
Imagine if we knew that China was paying people to addict Americans for TikTok. That's essentially what they're doing, except for when instead of addicting them to TikTok, they're addicting them to a chemical that's killing them.
That's right. That's right. So what this committee found was specifically that the Chinese government is subsidizing, giving tax credits and other subsidies to Chinese chemical companies that produce the precursors, which are the component parts that make up the drug fentanyl. And that's why you get the headline like that, and you get the report from the committee, which is the Chinese government is subsidizing the export of chemicals that are killing Americans, and the body count is massive. I mean, we're looking at 100,000 potentially people a year. I mean, the numbers kind of vary because you don't always get the reporting, but it's a massive number of people, certainly more than die every year in car accidents, are dying of fentanyl overdoses. And as we always make the point, these are not primarily people who are addicted to fentanyl, the people you see in San Francisco walking around and shaking. These are people that are taking maybe a Vicodin or an Adderall that happens to be laced with fentanyl, and so they die of an overdose without even knowing that they're taking fentanyl.
No, it's a massive problem. And not only is China subsidizing the production of the precursor, which is the chemical that goes in the fentanyl, but the report also found that a Chinese government website provides details of those subsidies which so they're advertising, here's how you get the money from us, the Chinese government, to make the chemicals that then kill Americans. So, I mean, that's a big deal. And then also Chinese e-commerce websites openly market these illegal drugs to foreign buyers using cryptocurrencies, which Beijing prohibits. And that's another key kind of link between the TikTok story, which I think people are largely familiar with. Everyone says TikTok, that's bad for China.
Yeah.
I think a growing number of people are connecting China to fentanyl, largely because of the reporting in your book. But why it matters is TikTok is not something China allows in China.
Right.
But it's something they export to the United States, and it's the same thing for this fentanyl and precursor production. It's not something they allow there.
Bingo.
But they have state-sponsored websites that advertise it for the exporting to other places, including the United States.
That's right. So this is a massive, important development. It did get some coverage. I noticed NBC News and other news outlets did cover this story. So maybe the conversation is starting to turn. And we've had this certainly happen before in our researching, that in the wake of what we do and in the explosive reporting that we do, other news entities and other congressional committees follow in. So it's very, very encouraging. Now, what the report doesn't do, I think the flaw and the shortcoming is it doesn't go far enough, because all they look at is one link in this chain, this fentanyl chain. They look at the precursors, the chemicals that go into the creation of fentanyl. They don't point out, as we do in the book, that 40% of these fentanyl precursor companies are actually Chinese state-owned and politically connected. But even more importantly, they neglect the important other facets of how these drugs end up killing Americans. You have the precursors coming from China. 90% of those precursors are shipped where? To the port of Manzanillo in Mexico. The international terminal at the port of Manzanillo is run by a Chinese company close to the Chinese state. But then those precursors get shipped to northern Mexico, where 2,000 Chinese nationals reportedly help the drug cartels turn these precursors into actual fentanyl itself. That is not mentioned in the report. That's another step in this sort of damning process.
You've also talked about the money, because the money is obviously a key component. That's one of the takeaways from this report, how China gives these companies money from China, but then the money on the back end ends up in these Chinese banks. And we want to point out that as you've reported, and as I think a tag-along fact that's relevant to this, is there was a joint DEA and State Department investigation that lasted from 2017 to 2020, and they found that 1,000 Chinese communist students on visas deposited $1 billion in drug money into America's largest banks, right? I mean, so the Chinese national students here on student visas are part of the money laundering scheme as well. So that it's Chinese fentanyl, and it's killing Americans at record numbers. I mean, medical experts would agree that fentanyl is the leading cause for death for Americans 18 to 45, is the biggest reason why our life expectancy has actually started to decrease for the first time.
Right.
And as pointed out also in a kind of relevant fact connected to this report, it's not just the deaths. You got 2.6 million children being raised by other relatives due to their parents' addiction or deaths related to drugs. So, I mean, the premise is China's waging war with us, and we don't want to acknowledge it. There certainly seems to be a hefty body count as a result.
Absolutely. And you have to ask yourself, how is this not war?
Right.
In other words, think about another situation where you would have this many Americans dying caused by a foreign power, and we would not consider this an act of war. China's, of course, being cagey about it. They will deny that they have any involvement in it, but it is an act of war against a civilian population.
And the Biden administration, to me, what's so troubling is I saw this story today that hospitals are now going to be asked to report on their greenhouse gas emissions as part of a new Medicare proposal.
Yeah.
And that seems weird. And it's like, well, what does that have to do with China and fentanyl and America's crisis? We did a podcast a couple of weeks ago about the way that the Biden administration, through executive order, has encouraged and actually is sort of making all the different federal agencies participate in voter turnout.
Right.
We've got, hey, if you're part of SNAP fraud and EBT, or you're getting an EBT card, you now are going to get information about how to register for vote. They're using every federal agency to register people to vote. It's expanding the scope of what we've asked government to do, we expect government to do. The point is they're willing to let government do whatever it is they want them to do if they think it's important enough. In this case, it's turning out Democrat voters. But if you have this fentanyl crisis, you would think that the Biden administration would be creative and expansive and I guess proactive in terms of getting some response to this problem, yet they've failed to do so. And that I think makes it more damning. And then the financial links that you've documented the Biden administration has, or Joe Biden's family has, with Chinese fentanyl relationships, possibly explains why.
Yeah, I think that's right. But the inaction by our government is the truly shocking thing here. And the hope is that with this congressional report, you start to get more buy-in from Republicans and Democrats that this is a major problem. And as the report, as we talked about, talks about precursor chemicals. We talked about where those precursor chemicals come, which is the port of Manzanillo. We've talked about the 2,000 Chinese nationals in northern Mexico. Then when they're actually making the pills, they actually get the pill presses and the pill molds, the Mexican drug cartels, they get those from China as well. So there's another example where, China has tight control over its population. They control packages that go in and out of the country, but they do not stop the mass exports of pill presses and pill molds from China to Mexico to the Mexican drug cartels. That's another example of how they are linked with this process. And then the other components, as you mentioned, are money laundering and cartel communications. The drug cartels need secure communications. What do they use? They use Chinese-based apps and communication devices that they know the Chinese will not share those encrypted communications with U.S. law enforcement. So this is a Chinese operation. The congressional report covers the important early link in the chain, but they have yet to get to those other links. Maybe they're going to issue some other reports. That's the hope.
Maybe they don't need to, because maybe the Biden administration's actually already solved this problem. I'm not sure if you saw this, Peter Schweizer. You're too busy getting ready to sell all these books.
Yeah.
But in January, the Biden administration, you're welcome for this, launched a bilateral counter-narcotics working group.
Yes.
As a key to curbing the flow of these precursor chemicals from China to Mexico. So never fear, the Biden administration actually is here. They launched a bilateral, it sounds very impressive, bilateral counter-narcotics working group. And the group, if you just listen to what they say, has produced, quote, concrete specific actions by Chinese authorities against firms linked to these shipments. And Gus Marcus told us this in February. So what do you say to that?
It must be true. Well, what I say to that is the Obama administration engaged with the Chinese. I don't know if it was officially a working group.
But was it bilateral?
Yeah, exactly. But the Obama administration approached China and said, this is a problem. China says, we'll take care of it. They didn't. The Trump administration, I give Trump a lot of credit. He publicly made a lot of noise about this issue. Xi told him, we'll take care of it. Never took care of it. Now you have the Biden administration doing and saying the same thing. And it's the posture and the approach that they're taking. They've got this working group, which assumes that both sides are coming in with sort of a good faith effort, right? We both want to solve this problem. We both recognize it as a problem. Do the Chinese actually recognize this as a problem?
Well, not according to their embassy spokesperson, Liu Pengyu, because they said, quote, the fentanyl crisis in the United States is not caused by the Chinese side, and blindly blaming China cannot solve the U.S.'s own problem.
Yeah, so this is the problem. You have a working group. You and I have a working group. Even though we don't agree that something's a problem, you're not going to get anything done.
We can still work on it, though.
Yeah, we'll still work on it.
As a group.
Yeah, we still get
possibly a bilateral one.
And we get those wonderful bilateral dinners at expensive hotels. We get some international travel. We get some frequent flyer. I mean, it's absurd. And the posture that the Biden administration has taken is there will be no finger pointing. We're not going to finger point at China about this. I mean, are you kidding me? Of course you have to finger point. That's the only way you're going to get attention focused on this is by calling them out, embarrassing them, and threatening them with concrete action is the only way that they're going to actually consider addressing this.
It's interesting because this report came out last week, and almost, I think, on the same day as this report came out, Joe Biden made news at a campaign stop in Pennsylvania where he told steel workers, I think a steelworker union, that, hey, I know things are tough. We're considering tripling the tariffs on Chinese steel. And it's interesting because only because of your book do I know this, that's actually like the idea that Joe Biden would be saying a tough thing against China is actually part of the business model that China's come to expect from its business partners, yeah?
Yeah. And so let me ask you this.
Yes.
We're two countries, the nation of Eric,
okay,
the nation of Peter.
Finally, I'm sovereign.
Exactly. And you the terrible country that you are, you are killing some of the Peter of Nations people.
I deny it.
My strong, powerful response is going to be, I'm going to put some tariffs on some of your goods. I mean, that's what they're doing.
But what do they call it? Big help with a little bad mouth?
Yes, and this is what China is expecting from leaders that they have co-opted. Elite capture is what they call it. They recognize that somebody like Joe Biden has to say and do things from time to time that make them look bad. Talk about human rights, talk about the Uyghurs, say we're going to put tariffs on Chinese steel. But on the big stuff, the stuff that really matters to them, Joe Biden is completely absent. And this is exactly the posture that China expects from somebody like Joe Biden.
Which is why I think looking at how they've been proactive in other areas that seem less significant matters, because it shows you they can do it if they want to, right?
Yes.
If you really think climate change is a big deal, which obviously they do, hey, now hospitals, well, how big is your climate impact and footprint? Because we want to know. Otherwise, we're going to maybe hold back some federal funds for you. Hey, Department of Education, we may not give you money unless you're using people on campus to register students to vote. Like, they will be active about certain things, but you would say, as someone who studies government, studies actions, they're absolutely not doing what they could be doing.
Not at all.
And members of Congress, and this is a big deal to bring it back to the report, agree with you because they've released a whole list of possible solutions. Now, some of them sound very bureaucratic, like establish a joint task force, provide law enforcement intelligence officials statutory authorities to go execute their responsibilities, close regulatory enforcement gaps exploited by these money launderers. So, I mean, it's a lot of policy stuff, but they also point out that there's an executive order that Joe Biden has the ability to do much of this if he wants to right now.
Yeah, he does. He has the power in his hands, and it's really a question of having the heart to do it. Mm-hmm. I mean, look at something that is unrelated, but I think illustrates the point. Look at the situation in Israel. Joe Biden has called out Israel, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, because in their battle with Hamas, there have been civilian casualties. And look, that's going to happen when Hamas is hiding in civilian areas. But they've called them out. They've threatened them with sanctions. Joe Biden hasn't called out the Chinese for actually killing Americans. We're not talking about Palestinians. We're talking about actual Americans. The point is, as president, you have the bully pulpit. You can call attention to something, and you have all kinds of levers of power, executive actions, sanctions that can be applied. You're doing this to us. Well, guess what? We're going to do something else to you that's going to cost you big time. Steel tariffs is not going to cut it. And no finger pointing is not going to cut it. So Biden has demonstrated his willingness to do this to allied countries like Israel, but he will not do it to our chief adversary, China. That's the paradox and the thing that's so shocking here. And I think the only way it makes sense is when you trace the financial ties that the Biden family has, not just with Chinese actors, but with Chinese actors that were actually sort of involved in the fentanyl trade.
Fentanyl adjacent, absolutely.
Fentanyl adjacent, exactly.
No, and I think it's so. Put it another way, because it's a great point. I mean, I think just to say, hey, they ask the federal government to do X, Y, and Z on these topics, but they've been far more restrained in directing the fentanyl response. Verbally, you're absolutely right. He's been more aggressive and more rebukey to Israel.
Rebukey, is that a word?
It is now. In their response to, it means to rebuke. So he's been more aggressive verbally with Israel in their response to October 7th attacks on Hamas than he has been to China.
Absolutely.
And there, to your point, Americans haven't been killed by Israel's response to Hamas, but they absolutely have been killed because of what China's doing in the United States with fentanyl.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing, as I point out in the book, is that Joe Biden has raised issues with President Xi directly. When they met in 2023, one of the things that he challenged him on and said, I'm going to be very upset, and it is going to damage your relationship with us if we find out that Chinese weapons are helping the Russians kill Ukrainians.
That's right. Don't you dare let Chinese weapons get to Russia.
Exactly, and kill Ukrainians. And I would support that statement. The problem is, why are you more concerned with Chinese weapons killing Ukrainians than Chinese chemical weapons killing Americans? And that's what is so troubling about what Biden has done here. Look, I think what the Congressional Committee has done is good. It's bipartisan. I wish the report had been stronger, but sometimes to get bipartisan, to get consensus, you have to do what you do. And let's hope this is the beginning of a series of steps that this Congressional Committee is going to take that will bring pressure on the Biden administration. I think the TikTok legislation is another one. It is fast-tracked through the House. Looks like there's going to be a vote in the Senate, and let's hope there's enough pressure on Joe Biden that he will actually sign that bill.
So don't look now, Peter Schweizer, and we still have to exit the studio where this is being filmed, so don't let your head get too big. But since blood money has come out, I mean, these are all real things.
Yeah.
The House has passed legislation to force the divestment of TikTok from China.
Yeah.
You've got a report saying China's helping subsidize the killing of Americans via the fentanyl and the chemicals that go into it. And you've got Democrats now saying, yeah, this is a real problem. So we are seeing a lot of movement. And I think the conversation around China and its relationship with the United States, absolutely now, fentanyl, TikTok, part of the conversation, both things that were, I think, prominently mentioned and reported on in your book.
Yeah, we have big sections in the book. And look, this is what we try to do at GAI, and this is what we always try to do with our audience. We are ahead of the curve because we are truth-driven and fact-driven. And the way that you get action in Washington, D.C., or inaction, one is with a bunch of lobbyist dollars and a lot of money to campaign contributions. We don't have that. The other way you do it, though, is truth.
Yeah.
You bring out information, you shame people, you confront people, and there are still enough, I think, honest actors in Washington that will raise the battle flag and carry forth. And that's what we've done with this book, as we've done with previous, and we're very, very excited with the results, and we will be reporting more to you about this in the weeks and months ahead.
We have a phrase that we use when it comes to, we say opinions get shrugs and facts get shares. And the facts are we have a major fentanyl problem. China is subsidizing the importing of chemicals that make fentanyl to the United States via Mexico. And the Biden family has made money from someone whose business partner was the head of the fentanyl operation with Mexico's cartels.
Yeah, the head of the Chinese gang that set up the Sinaloa cartel and the drug trade. It is globalism gone awry. Well, we appreciate you as always listening to this podcast and taking this time. We know your time is valuable. You can find out more about the research we do at thedrilldown.com, and you can find Blood Money wherever books are sold, and you can find this podcast wherever fine podcasts are located. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.